You're listening to Fulfilling Career, Happy Life, the podcast for accomplished professionals who want to identify what's next in their career and make it happen without compromising what matters most. I'm your host, Randi Roberts, an executive and career life coach, and I'm glad you're here. If you want to feel more energized about your work again, this show is for you. So let's get into it. Hi, welcome to the Fulfilling Career, Happy Life podcast. So glad you're here. This season, we've been dealing with topics that we don't always think about as having an impact on our career, yet they do. So they've been topics like courage, level of risk aversion, comfort with conflict, those kinds of things. And as I've gone through this season, I've realized that a discussion on boundaries is really important because all of these topics kind of point to some way in which we're getting in our own way, or we're blocking ourselves from bringing our best, bringing our talents to whatever the thing is, as big as our career or as small as a task. So boundaries has to be part of this conversation. Then add to that, it feels like I am having conversations about boundaries with half of my clients lately. And when those things start to show up in waves, I know there's something there that we need to talk about. So having all those thoughts in mind, I knew I need to talk to Michelle Pollack today. Michelle is a colleague and a friend. She is an executive leadership and life coach. There's a lot of crossover in what Michelle and I do. We've done some really cool collaborations, and I know that you are going to see in the course of this conversation why she is the person that I needed to speak to about this. So, Michelle, I'm so happy you're here.
I'm so happy to be back, Randi. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so boundaries. This is a topic that you and I have talked about when microphones are not running many times because it's so important. I like to think that everything we say, we offline, we would say online, but we'll see how that goes. So let's start here, Michelle. What do we mean by boundaries? I feel like I'm seeing the word everywhere, but like at its core, what are we talking about here?
So, my favorite definition of boundaries that I have found that resonates the most with me and I find allows people to see boundaries in a totally different light comes from Melissa Urban, who actually is the person who created Whole30. And she also has a book out. I think it's called The Book of Boundaries. I actually love hearing her talk about boundaries more than I enjoyed the book, to be perfectly frank. So if anyone is curious, go Google Melissa Urban Boundaries podcast. Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to read the book, but here's how she defines boundaries, and I think it's so stellar. Clear limits that you establish around the ways you allow people to engage with you so that you can keep yourself and your relationships safe and healthy.
Wow. Okay. You got to give that to me again.
I thought you might want it again. So boundaries are clear limits that we establish around the ways we allow people to engage with us so that we can keep ourselves and our relationships safe and healthy. And the reason I love that definition so much is because it's such a positive perspective on what boundaries actually do when we enforce them and when we exercise them in our lives. And I think so many people get really caught up with boundaries because they're afraid of the conflict that might happen when they actually have boundaries or enforce boundaries. But when you think of them as a way to keep yourself and your relationships healthy, it's actually in service of your relationships with other people.
That's like mic drop right there. That is huge. And that's making me think of so many conversations I've had recently. I love that so much. Okay, we could stop here, but we probably shouldn't.
Right? Because it's just such a perspective shift. And when I heard that definition, I was like, Yes, that's the epitome of why boundaries are important.
Yeah.
Because when you're doing it in a way that's healthy, it's actually in service of things. It's in service of your relationships. It keeps your relationships, it will deepen your relationships, it will make them better.
Yeah. This brings to mind for me a conversation I had with a client, I don't know, maybe 2 days ago. And she's a lovely young woman with tremendous leadership potential that she's just beginning to unfold. Like it's beautiful to be on this journey with her. And her company's growing. She's moving into a new level. She has more people around her, which deals with how do you delegate all of that. And what she realized was she hadn't established any rules of engagement with her teams on
Mhm.
how they were constantly pinging her and asking her to address questions and all of those things. So we had this conversation about boundaries, and her fear was if she established them, just clear, here's how we're going to operate so that we're
Mhm.
efficient. She was worried that she would be sending the message to them that they had been doing something wrong. And so not only did she have a need for boundaries, but then she was taking such responsibility for it.
Yeah.
It was a real eye opener for me.
That's such an interesting thing, and I think it's so common for a lot of people. I know I have felt this way before, and I've had clients who felt exactly the same way, and there's such an easy fix for that, Randy, which is taking responsibilities for the fact that you didn't set the boundaries, but that now you're
Exactly.
recognizing it's going to work better if you do.
Exactly.
It's just, it's that simple. Like, I'm realizing we didn't actually set up clear rules of engagement, and I want to take the opportunity to do that now. I think it's going to make our team function better. Done. Move
Yeah.
on. Set the boundaries.
And that's exactly the conversation we had. But some things you said in Melissa Urban's description of boundaries, I think would have helped us in that conversation. I want to go back to her with it because it was around how this is in service to the relationship.
Yeah.
Because what she and I talked about was not only was this not working for her, but she may have been getting in the way of these individuals spreading their own wings by being too available to solve problems for them. So there's every reason to do it, but you got to talk about it. You can't just shift and let people fill in the blanks on their own.
I think, I had a conversation with a client yesterday that had some similarities to what you're talking about. And one of the things we touched on is how our tendency as human beings is to think that all of our brains work the same way. So, whatever thought we're having about how a relationship should function must be the way the other person is thinking about it. And so, when they do something different or they act in a way that irritates us or doesn't work for us, we assume they know exactly what they're doing and that they would know that it wouldn't work for us. And most of the time, the opposite is true. Most of the time, people have no idea because they're working the way their brain works and operates. And so, really, boundaries are about clear communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, we really overthink it. Yeah.
I think we are never taught to have conversations about this stuff. We just are never taught. And to me, it's like, you know, it doesn't matter what relationship, if it's a romantic relationship, if it's a friendship, if it's a familial relationship, if it's a work relationship, we are never taught to actually state clearly what is working for us, what's not working for us, what we want, to have a give and take conversation about it. And we just think it's all going to work out. And that's it. We are not inside, again, we're not inside each other's brains. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
But we're all so averse to having those conversations, and um really they are the key to things functioning in a way that works not just for ourselves but also for the other person as well, because if you have an opportunity to set a boundary, they get the opportunity to see that that's okay too. As a leader, that's so important. I was thinking when you were talking about your client, if she's answering them all the time when they ping her about an issue, she's setting a standard of sorts, right? That
Yep.
then the people who are underneath her start to feel like they have to operate that way. And so giving permission to work in a way that really works for you does that for your entire team.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and the talking about it, like, somehow we think we can solve this in our own heads, but the
Mm-hmm.
reality is this is a I'm gonna call it a problem. It's a dynamic that exists between people, and most of the time when it's between people, you gotta solve it between people.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can communicate what you want the boundary to be. And look, if you're the boss, there's hierarchy, there's power, you can demand that. But in a really healthy situation, you lay out what you need and the other person gets to respond. And maybe it becomes like negotiation makes it sound too formal, but a discussion of how this can work for both of you.
Yeah. It's funny because I think everything is a negotiation. I mean, who's going to feed the kids for dinner is everything's a little bit of a negotiation, you know? And so when you have that discussion, the important thing is to be clear on where you are flexible and where you're not flexible. And to find that out from the other person as well, right? Where are they flexible and where are they not? And can you meet or not?
This is it's funny because I never really thought about the connection between boundaries and negotiation before. And what it brought back to me was when I was in business school, one of my favorite classes was negotiation skills, and I was really good at it. And the
Mhm.
reason is I'm always I mean, I'm a middle child. Maybe that's what it is. I'm always looking for the win-win. I don't want scorched earth. I don't want to walk away with everything. I want everyone walking away feeling good. And if we took that approach of negotiation to boundaries, it's interesting. Now, I don't mean to say that when we're setting boundaries, someone else gets to decide. These are still ours to hold. But maybe that's what the difference is between setting them and being able to implement them. Because that's one of the things. Okay, so here's my question.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to honor our boundaries, even if we know what they are?
I think it's so hard for us to honor our boundaries because we're afraid of conflict. I think a lot of it comes back to the fear of being in conflict with somebody. And so we abandon ourselves in favor of the other person's needs so that we don't have to get into conflict. I think it's all tied together. I really do. Which is why I love Melissa Urban's definition again,
Yeah,
because it goes back to the positive of keeping your relationships healthy. And we all know that when we don't honor our own boundaries in honor of somebody else's needs and wants, usually there's a fair amount of resentment that accompanies that. Now, it might start out as little resentment, but usually it grows and grows and grows, and that's not a healthy relationship.
right.
That's not honoring the relationship, right? It's putting the avoidance of conflict over a good relationship. And the truth is, when a relationship, be it work, again, this is when I refer to relationships, I know we're largely talking about leadership here, but and career, but it's not any different in any of your relationships.
It's true.
So you know, you find out very quickly in conflict with somebody, the whole point of conflict, I I'm sure you had this conversation, conflict makes relationships grow and get better. It moves you in the direction of your goals. It's very hard to do those things without actually solving conflict.
It's so funny is I do a lot of work with corporate leadership teams, and we talk a lot about the dynamics of healthy teams and conflict. Doing conflict well is one of the really important things. And I never really bring that thought from teams to individuals as leaders, but it's so relevant.
Yes. Because and there is such a thing as unhealthy conflict. And I think the reason so many of us are averse to conflict is because we've been involved in unhealthy conflict. And that's what we assume conflict always is. Yet another thing that we should be taught how to do well. like in high school, there should be a class on conflict resolution. I mean, it would make the world so much better.
It's true. It would. It's funny that you mentioned high school. I mean, it would. But I think about like our approach to conflict is rooted in how did our family of origin handle conflict?
Yes.
And so it's almost instinctive in ways that are either healthy or I think more often not healthy.
Yeah. Uh I mean, it's very rare that I've met a person who's just good at conflict. I was terrible at it, and I'm still not always. I mean, it's not easy.
Mm-mm.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I
It
know
doesn't
you've been
feel good.
talking a lot lately about you know, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that's something I talk about a lot as well. It isn't comfortable, but growth, I mean, there's a reason they call it growing pains. Growth is not comfortable.
Right. Right.
But I do think that's why people tend to avoid boundaries or to abandon their boundaries. It's because it's in favor of taking care of somebody else's needs because they don't want to deal with what might come up if they hold their boundary.
Well, that's interesting because then I think another layer to that is if they're concerned about other people's needs, they're concerned that if they set and hold boundaries, they are being selfish. And we are taught that's bad.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, I mean, so I work largely with women. So this is particular to women, uh, or those socialized as women, is that we have been socialized to put other people's wants and needs before our own. And so it does feel very uncomfortable and unusual for women to actually say, well, this is actually what works for me. And I mean, that's a whole, I don't know if you want me to go into why that's the case that we've been socialized that way.
Sure.
Um, it goes back to it goes back to years and years to our patriarchal society and the fact that women could not own land, could not have a job, could not have a bank account. Um, Even once they could have a job for a period of time, they couldn't keep their own wages. And then eventually they were allowed to keep their own wages, but they couldn't. It wasn't until 1974 that a woman could open a bank account by herself without a man, or have a credit card by herself, or get a mortgage by herself.
I know that blows my mind when I think about that short time span.
So it's, you had to rely on a man, a husband, a brother, a father, a son, to make sure that you could quite literally survive in this world. You had to, and so the way that our brains worked around that was we took care of those people so they would take care of us. Because at the end of the day, they didn't need us to survive, but we needed them. So we made sure that their needs were taken care of first, and that way we could live. That's really simplifying it, but so it's still in our DNA to put others' needs before our own. But we all know at the end of the day, that doesn't work because we end up being really irritated, frustrated, burnt out, um, and 50 million other things that aren't good for us. And actually it usually, as you pointed out, is not in service of the other people as well.
Hmm. Yeah. All of that is true. And I think this is very relevant to women and men for sure, because we're all in the world together. And these things impact all of us. So I think we're making a good case for boundaries. Like, yay, boundaries. I think
Yay,
our
boundaries.
listeners can tell we're both believers. So if someone's listening to this and feeling like, yeah, I need to take better control of this, I need to establish this, I need to get more active, whatever that feels like for them, how can we help them get started?
So I think the first thing is figuring out what's not working for you. Like it's, I think the work that you and I do is so is so important because it helps our clients to ask the questions they're not used to asking. And normally when something doesn't work, we don't actually sit down and go, well, what's really underneath all of this for me? Why do I feel the way I feel? What's in the way of me getting what I need? Like, it takes some time. It's not just automatic, like, oh, I need a boundary. A lot of the time, it takes some time to understand. There's usually a feeling that comes up that's an uncomfortable feeling. Understanding, sitting with that uncomfortable feeling rather than shoving it away, right? Actually being with the feeling to understand what's going on for yourself, what's happening that is bringing this feeling up for you is usually the first key to where you have a need that's not may not be being met. Um and so I think, getting clear about what you're feeling and why, and then kind of looking at what would work for you. What do you need? And it's funny that you talk about being selfish because I think it is important, especially in a leadership role, to consider the other people, that it's not just all about, well, I need this, so this is the way it's going to be. It's also, okay, how do I meet my needs and the needs of the team as well? Right. And getting clear. And that sometimes it takes a little bit of time. Sometimes it's not just a 5-minute process. It might be a 50-minute coaching session. It might be more than one. Um, and as I always say, the coaching happens in between the sessions. So often we'll have the conversation and then it'll simmer and the answer, or, the realization will come in between the sessions. But I think it's starting to ask yourself questions about, where do I have a need that's not being met? What's not working for me? And values. Do I have a value that's being kind of stomped all over? Is there something that's important to me that is being disregarded here? And how do I approach creating a boundary from my values also? So it's not like a step one, step two, step three process. I'm sure I could turn it into that, but I tend to just think it's more about curiosity.
Yeah.
If you come at it from a place of curiosity and processing everything you're feeling through the lens of curiosity about what's going on for me and what's going to help shift this so that I feel better and it still serves what I need it to serve, or what we need it to serve, is how you kind of get to the answer. Is that helpful?
I think it is helpful. And you're right. It would be nice if we had a step one, step two, step three for people. And sometimes I feel, I don't know if bad's the right word. I feel unsatisfied to tell clients, to tell listeners that, well, it starts with introspection, it starts with self-awareness, and you got to look within. But the truth is, that is where so much of this starts. And we talk about authenticity and knowing yourself and knowing your values and that kind of thing. And I guess the truth is, for people who aren't willing, able, excited about that, being curious about themselves, maybe this work just isn't for them. That's okay.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't, nothing is a have to,
Right.
but at the end of the day, if something's uncomfortable for you, or you aren't, or you don't like it, or it's not working and you want it to change, the key to that is that inner work. It is that introspection, because nothing outside of you is going to give you the answer about why it's not working.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the conversations that I will have with clients sometimes, and I had with that client I mentioned the other day, was around, all right, let's think about this a different way. If you were able to establish this boundary, and in this case, it's a very micro example of people just sending her messages all the time and she's constantly available, so she doesn't get to focus on her own work. It's a problem. So in that example, what I did was I said, okay, here's how you feel it would operate better for you if you set aside specific time, or, whatever ideas she had. Let's park that for a minute. She was feeling so uncomfortable. I said, let's think about how this might be good for the other. And we
Love.
just did some brainstorming around what's good in that for the team. And she came up with some pretty powerful things. And in a way, we went into this discussion. It was in the back of my mind. is this manipulative? Is this going to help her like come up with a trick for how to do it? It doesn't matter. It gave her a shift on the axis, a different way to frame it. If it gave her a permission structure to put into place something that was more productive all around, like it was great. And she was excited. She felt empowered. She felt excited. It was almost like I was watching her leadership, like her take a step up the leadership rung,
Yeah,
or bad analogy, but you know what I mean.
I love it.
It was cool.
It's really
Different way to
cool.
look at it.
Yeah, I think so often I I think so often when something comes up that feels sticky in business, if we can step outside of it and reframe it of how do we make this what is positive about this? What is going to work? You can't always find it. There's not always something, but a lot of times there is a way to put a positive perspective on how this will serve all of the people involved. And you can't make somebody else see it through that lens, but if you present it that way, you and I both know if we go into something thinking this is terrible, I'm delivering terrible news, it's going to be received as terrible news because that's the way we're going to show up and the way we're going to, even if we try to make it sound good, our voice is going to have that kind of intonation of, I'm so sorry, I'm delivering the worst news. And if we come at it from a perspective of, this is really great news, and here are the reasons why, it's harder for somebody to go down that hole of this is the worst thing ever and this is not going to be good,
Yeah.
So that energy that we bring to any scenario, even conflict, if you bring positive energy to conflict, if there's something if you can think about the idea of conflict as this is an opportunity for us to work through things to strengthen our relationship and move the needle forward, it's gonna be a better interaction, even though it's still conflict.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because my own coach is in my head about, narrate the situation. And a lot of times from a leadership perspective, we can do that in terms of, if we feel uncomfortable going into a situation like this, we're changing the rules, we're operating in a different way. It can be speaking into that. Look, this is going to feel different. We want to try something different. Here's how this, I want this to go, getting the other's opinion on it. And then it doesn't have to be a one and done conversation. It
Hmm.
can be a check in on it. How's it going? Make it okay for the other person to work through what they need to work through on it too. The boundary we think we need to set may not be the most productive one. By shifting it a little bit could work better for everybody.
Yes, and sometimes you do need to create a clear boundary that is just, this won't work for me, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
There's both.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanna make sure that, there are scenarios where there is something that absolutely does not work for you. It might be, I don't email after 7 o'clock at night. So if you email me after 7 o'clock at night, I will get back to you. But I start emailing at 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't know, or I return emails between 9 and 5, or I email between the hours of 1 and 3 every day so that I can make sure that I'm focusing on my other work. Whatever. These are all, it's just what works for you
Hmm.
so that you can be your best.
Hmm. It's funny
Um,
that brought to mind for me about one time, in the corporate setting, like every 2 years, you've got a new job, you've got a new boss, like things move around. So I was VP of marketing, I got a new boss. And he was a guy who he would send emails at like 11 o'clock, 11:30 at night. And I am in a bad habit of I check my phone a lot. I was used to be worse about it. So I would see an email from him at 11 o'clock and I'm like half asleep.
mhm,
And I would respond to it. And then he
mhm.
would respond to it. And this would go on for a while. And after a couple of weeks, I like was gonna fall apart. And I finally said to him, "Hey, I just have to let you know, like you're a late night guy. I'm an early morning person. I can't email with you at 11 o'clock or midnight." And he's like, "I don't expect you to do that." He said, I send them when I send them. You catch them when you catch them. When you respond, I respond. It creates something. He said, so just don't respond. I'm
Right.
like, wow, that was easy.
That was easy. But notice how you felt like you had to.
Yeah. The story in my head was,
Yeah.
very powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And then all you had to do was open your mouth, set a boundary, and he was totally there and ready to honor it.
Yeah. It's amazing what happens when we actually speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Very cool. All right. This is great. I love some of the things you said so much in terms of sort of like paying attention to your spidey sense almost. If something's not working, it might be that you need to set a boundary in some way. You might need to get curious what's going on with you. We talked about boundaries being about negotiation, which I love so much. In some ways, maybe it starts with ourselves. It's getting out of our own way. And then the flipping it over about what could be positive about this boundary for yourself or for other can really shift your relationship to setting it, honoring it, holding it, that kind of thing. It's such good leadership by example.
Yes. Yes.
This is great. All right, Michelle, I love it. Tell our listeners how they can find you, how they can hear more from you.
You can find me at my website, michellepollack.com. And I actually have a freebie that is so aligned with this called How to Stop Saying Yes When You Really Mean No.
My God, I didn't even know I was setting you up for that.
I
This
didn't
is
either.
great.
I didn't think about it, but
How can people find that?
In your show notes. It's
Okay,
going to be in
perfect.
your show notes because
Perfect.
I don't know what the I don't know what the URL is, but my website is michellepollack.com, and you can find it's right on the top of that website too, so you could find it there as well.
Exactly. Say what the name of it is again.
How to Stop Saying Yes When You Really Mean No.
Yeah, and I've been through that. It is a great tool. Okay, super. I will absolutely make sure that your website and that link are in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me. I really, as always, enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure next season I'll think of something else I need to talk to you about. So
Awesome.
Open invitation to come back.
Thanks, Randi. I love chatting with you.
Thanks so much for listening to Fulfilling Career, Happy Life. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, follow, rate, and review. Do all the things to show your support for this podcast. It helps other professionals who want to feel more energized about their work again find us. And if you want to take this thinking further, please follow me on LinkedIn, where I share content on a regular basis. You can also get on my email list by downloading the Career Satisfaction Assessment or through my website. All these links are in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. I truly appreciate that you make the time for yourself to listen to the show. See you next week.